My husband skipped our anniversary dinner. I sat alone at a candlelit table while he whispered sweet lies to another woman. He thought I didn't know, thought I'd cry and wait. But when he came home, he found something he never expected. A house as empty as his promises. Before we continue, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you can continue supporting us and watching new videos every day. Something wasn't right. I'd been married to John for 12 years, and I knew his patterns, his habits, his routines. But over the past 2 months, everything had started to change in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. It began with the text messages. John had never been particularly attached to his phone before, but suddenly it was like an extension of his hand. The way he'd snatch it up when it chimed, the slight smile that would cross his face as he read whatever was on the screen. A smile not meant for me. The way he'd quickly turn it face down whenever I entered the room. "Who was that?" I asked casually one evening as we sat on the couch, pretending to watch a show neither of us was paying attention to. "Just work stuff," he replied without looking at me, his thumbs rapidly typing a response. "Jenkins needs those reports by tomorrow." I nodded, though I knew Jenkins was on vacation this week. I'd heard John mention it just days before. Then came the late nights. Once, maybe twice a month, John might work late. That was normal in his industry. But now, 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, he'd text with the same excuse. "Got caught up with a client. Don't wait up." The emotional distance hurt the most. John and I used to talk about everything. Our days, our dreams, silly things that made us laugh. Now conversations felt forced, superficial. The comfortable silences we once shared had become awkward and tense. When was the last time he'd really looked at me during dinner? When was the last time he'd reached for my hand while we watched TV? "You seem distracted lately," I ventured one morning over breakfast. "Is everything okay at work?" "Fine," he answered, already scrolling through his phone. "Just busy." He kissed my cheek before leaving. A quick, perfunctory gesture that felt more like habit than affection. I noticed he was wearing the blue shirt I'd given him for his birthday, the one he'd claimed was too fancy for regular work days. His hair was freshly trimmed, and was that new cologne? That night, I checked our joint credit card statement and found charges for restaurants I'd never been to, on nights when John was supposedly working late. A florist charge from last week. A jewelry store purchase from 3 days ago, not near any family birthday or our anniversary. Each discovery was like a small cut. Individually, perhaps they could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. I called my sister, needing to voice my fears to someone. "Am I crazy, Jen? Am I seeing problems where there aren't any?" "Trust your gut, Rachel," she said after I'd listed all the changes I'd noticed. "You know John better than anyone." That was just it. I thought I knew him. Now I wasn't so sure. The final straw came when I found a receipt in his jacket pocket while doing laundry. A hotel bar downtown, from a Tuesday when he'd told me he was at a conference in Phoenix. The date and timestamp were unmistakable. That night, after another text saying he'd be late, I sat at our kitchen table with a glass of wine, my laptop open in front of me. I'd never thought I'd be the kind of wife who'd need to hire someone to follow her husband. The thought made me feel sick, desperate, pathetic, but I needed to know. I typed "private investigator" into the search bar. Several options appeared, but one stood out. Discretion Assured Investigations. Their website was professional, with testimonials from clients who'd found the truth they needed to move forward. I took a deep breath and called the number. Mike Reynolds answered on the second ring. His voice was kind, non-judgmental as I haltingly explained my situation. "This is more common than you might think, Mrs. Wilson," he assured me. "Sometimes, we need confirmation of what we already suspect in our hearts." We arranged to meet the following day at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood. Mike was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had clearly seen every kind of human drama I'll need a recent photo of your husband, his typical schedule, and any patterns you've noticed in his behavior, he explained, sliding a contract across the table. I'll follow him for 1 week, document everywhere he goes, everyone he meets. You'll have photographic evidence, timestamps, locations, everything you need to make informed decisions about your next steps. My hand trembled slightly as I signed the papers. 1 week, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to know before our anniversary next Friday. Mike nodded understandingly. You'll have my report before then. And Mrs. Wilson. Whatever. We discover, remember. This is about his choices, not your worth. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. For 2 months, I'd been living with uncertainty, second-guessing myself, wondering if I was imagining things. In 7 days, I would know the truth, whatever it might be. The waiting began. Every morning I'd watch John leave for work, wondering if today would be the day Mike would catch him in a lie. Every evening when he texted that he'd be late, I wondered where he really was, who he was with. Was Mike there too, documenting it all with his camera? Our anniversary was approaching, and with it, the moment of truth. Little did John know that his secret life was no longer secret. Someone was watching, recording, gathering evidence of every betrayal. And I was finally going to know exactly what my husband had been hiding. Our anniversary arrived with the same morning routine we'd maintained for years. John kissed me on the cheek before leaving, promising he'd meet me at Mariposa, the upscale restaurant downtown where we'd celebrated every anniversary since our 5th. I've made reservations for 7, I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. Don't be late. Wouldn't miss it for the world, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He adjusted his tie, the blue one I'd given him last Christmas, and headed out the door. I spent the day in a strange limbo, moving through my usual routines while my mind raced with possibilities. Mike had promised his final report would arrive today, before dinner. Part of me hoped for a miracle, that all my suspicions would prove unfounded, that John's behavior had some innocent explanation I hadn't considered. At 5 o'clock, I began, getting ready, taking unusual care with my appearance. I chose the burgundy dress John had once said brought out the amber flecks in my eyes, styled my hair in loose waves, and applied makeup with a precision I rarely bothered with anymore. Looking in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me, composed, beautiful, and carrying a secret knowledge that was about to change everything. By 6:30, I was seated at our reserved table at Mariposa, a small velvet box containing John's anniversary gift, a vintage watch he'd admired months ago, tucked into my clutch. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and soft music, candles flickering on every table, casting dancing shadows across the white tablecloths. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" the waiter asked politely. "A glass of the Cabernet, please," I replied, checking my phone for the 3rd time. No messages from John, no report from Mike. At 7:15, I texted John, "Are you on your way?" The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "Running a bit late. Start without me." I ordered another glass of wine, smiling tightly at the waiter's sympathetic glance. By 7:45, I'd memorized every detail of the couple seated across from me, their easy laughter, the way they leaned toward each other, sharing some private joke. They reminded me of John and myself, years ago, before whatever this was had started eroding what we'd built. At 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed. My heart leapt, thinking it was John, but the notification showed Mike's name instead. Final report attached. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the email. There were dozens of photos, each one time-stamped and geotagged, along with a detailed written report. But I didn't need to read it all. The first image told me everything I needed to know. John, my husband of 12 years, was at another restaurant across town, The photo showed him seated at a candlelit table much like mine, except he wasn't alone. A woman with caramel-colored hair sat across from him, their hands intertwined on the table. The timestamp on the photo read, 7:52 p.m., tonight, right now, on our anniversary. I scrolled through more images from the past week. John entering an apartment building I didn't recognize. John and the woman shopping together. John kissing her in his car outside his office. Each photo was like a physical blow, yet I felt strangely detached, as if I were looking at strangers. The final photo showed them entering a jewelry store yesterday afternoon. The report noted he had purchased a gold necklace with a heart pendant. The same pendant I had glimpsed in a small box in his briefcase this morning, which I had assumed was my anniversary gift. I set my phone down and took a long sip of wine, surprised by my own calm. Shouldn't I be crying? Screaming? Rushing across town to confront them? Instead, I felt something unexpected settling over me. A profound clarity. "Would you like to order, ma'am?" the waiter asked gently. I realized I'd been sitting alone for over an hour. "No," I said, suddenly decisive. "Just the check for the wine, please." As I waited for the bill, I stared at my wedding ring, twisting it around my finger. All those nights I'd lain awake, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was being paranoid. The truth had been there all along. John had already left our marriage. His body just hadn't caught up with his heart. My phone buzzed again with a text from John. "So sorry, babe. Emergency client meeting. Might not make it tonight. Rain check?" I started to type several responses, deleting each one. What was there to say? That I knew he was lying? That I had photographic evidence of his betrayal? That he was, at this very moment, celebrating our anniversary with another woman? Instead, I simply wrote, "Okay." Outside the restaurant, the night, air was cool against my skin. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the reality of my situation wash over me. 12 years of marriage, ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. With me sitting alone at a restaurant while my husband built a life with someone else. Yet beneath the hurt and betrayal, I felt something else stirring. A sense of release. The constant anxiety of the past 2 months, the second-guessing, the desperate hope that I was wrong. All of it was gone now. In its place was a strange, almost peaceful certainty. I hadn't lost John tonight. I'd lost him months ago, perhaps. Even longer, the man I'd married, the life we'd planned together. It had been slipping away by degrees for longer than I'd allowed myself to recognize. Tonight was simply the confirmation of what my heart had already known. I hailed a taxi, the decision forming in my mind with each passing streetlight. This wouldn't end with a tearful confrontation or desperate pleas to save our marriage. This would end on my terms, with my dignity intact. As the city lights blurred past the window, I realized I wasn't crying. Instead, I felt a newfound strength building within me, the strength to walk away, to rebuild, to choose myself. John had made his choice. Now I would make mine. I arrived home to an empty house, the silence almost deafening after the ambient noise of the restaurant and taxi. For a moment, I stood in our foyer, looking at the space we'd created together. The wedding photos lining the hallway, the throw pillows I'd carefully selected to match our couch, the vase of fresh flowers John had brought home 3 days ago in what I now recognized as guilt, not affection. This had been our sanctuary, our shared dream. Now it felt like a museum dedicated to a relationship that no longer existed. I kicked off my heels and moved through the rooms with new purpose. No more waiting, no more wondering. I pulled out my phone and made a quick call. "Jen, it's me. You were right about John." My sister's sharp intake of breath was followed by a stream of curses and sympathies. "No, I'm okay, actually. but I need your help. Can you come over tomorrow morning? And can I stay with you for a while?" After hanging up, I went to our home office and pulled out the business card of a divorce attorney a colleague had recommended months ago. A recommendation I'd accepted with nervous laughter, insisting I'd never need it. I set it on the desk. For tomorrow. Tonight was about action, not legalities. I moved to our bedroom and pulled out my suitcases from the back of the closet. With methodical precision, I began packing my essentials: clothes, shoes, jewelry, toiletries. I was surprised by how little I actually cared about taking. Material things seemed suddenly unimportant compared to reclaiming my dignity, my future. I folded my favorite sweater. A memory surfaced of John hugging me from behind while I wore it, his chin resting on my shoulder as we watched snow fall outside our window. For a brief moment, grief threatened to overwhelm me. I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds to feel it, counting them out in my head, before taking a deep breath and continuing to pack. By midnight, my personal items were neatly organized into 3 suitcases. I'd call a moving company for the furniture that was truly mine. My grandmother's antique desk, the reading chair I'd brought from my apartment before we married. The rest, John could keep. I moved on to removing traces of myself from our shared spaces. I took down the photos of us together, leaving empty hooks on the walls. I gathered the books I'd collected over the years from our bookshelves, creating gaps like missing teeth in the previously perfect rows. I emptied my nightstand, my bathroom drawers, my side of the medicine cabinet. With each item I removed, I felt lighter, more resolved. This wasn't an impulsive reaction to hurt. It was a deliberate reclaiming of my life. At 2 a.m, I sat at our dining room table with a notepad, drafting what needed to be said. No accusations, no pleas, no anger, just facts, boundaries, and finality. When finished, I typed it up on our computer, printed it, and signed my name at the bottom. I called a 24-hour courier service and arranged for divorce papers to be delivered first thing in the morning. The woman on the phone didn't question why. Someone would need such documents at 3 a.m., for which I was grateful. While waiting for dawn, I methodically transferred my share of our joint account to my personal account, removed my name from our shared credit cards, and changed my passwords on all our mutual subscriptions. Financial independence had always been important to me, a lesson from my mother that I'd never fully appreciated until now. As morning light filtered through the curtains, the doorbell rang. The courier handed me a large envelope containing preliminary divorce papers my attorney had prepared weeks ago when I'd first called to inquire. Just in case, I'd told her then. I signed where indicated, my handwriting steady and clear. No tears smudged the ink. No hesitation stayed my hand. In the grounds for divorce section, I simply checked irreconcilable differences. Let John keep his dignity in the legal documents at least. The truth was between us. By 8 o'clock, Jen arrived with coffee and a fierce protectiveness in her eyes. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. "I'm not anymore," I replied, realizing it was true. The weeks of isolation and my suspicion and pain were over. I wasn't hiding anymore. Together, we loaded my suitcases into her car. I took one final walk through the house, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything essential. In our bedroom, his bedroom now, I placed my wedding ring on his pillow. No note, no explanation needed. On the dining room table, I left the manila envelope containing the divorce papers, my house key, and the USB drive Mike had provided with all the evidence of John's affair. Beside it, I placed the anniversary gift. I'd never given him. The vintage watch he'd admired months ago. Some petty part of me hoped he'd wear it and think of me, of what he'd thrown away. "You're sure about this?" Jen asked, as I stood at the door for the last time. "You could confront him, make him explain himself. You have every right." I shook my head, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. What would be the point? I know everything I need to know. The truth was, Confrontation would only give John the opportunity to lie, to make excuses, to turn this into a messy, drawn-out emotional battle. Or worse, to beg for forgiveness I wasn't prepared to give. This way, I maintained control of my exit, my dignity, my narrative. As we drove away, I didn't look back at the house. Instead, I looked out at the city stretching before us. At all, the possibilities that awaited me now that I was no longer tethered to betrayal and doubt. "Where to?" Jen asked, squeezing my hand. "Forward," I answered simply. And for the first time in months, I smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one I'd worn while pretending everything was fine. This wasn't the ending I'd expected for my marriage, but it was a beginning I was choosing for myself. I had been John's wife for 12 years. Now, I would discover who Rachel was without him. As Jen and I drove toward her apartment, my phone buzzed with a text from John. I glanced at it briefly. "Coming home soon. We need to talk." No apology, no explanation, just the expectation that I would be waiting, ready to hear whatever story he had prepared. I didn't reply. Let him come home. To the surprise I'd left him. Let him experience the emptiness I'd been feeling for months. Later that evening, I couldn't help wondering what John's face looked like when he finally walked through our front door. Had he called out my name, expecting me to answer? Had he rehearsed excuses on his drive home, preparing to explain why he'd missed our anniversary dinner? I imagined him loosening his tie as he entered, perhaps with the necklace he'd bought for his mistress tucked in his pocket, or maybe a hastily purchased replacement for me, a peace offering. It had worked before, after all. I pictured him flipping on the hallway light, noticing something was different, but not immediately understanding what. The familiar becoming suddenly unfamiliar. In my mind, I could see him moving through the house, calling my name with increasing urgency as he discovered the gaps on our bookshelves where my books had been, the missing photos from the mantel, the empty spaces where my belongings had lived for years. I imagined his confusion turning to panic as he checked our bedroom closet to find half of it empty, my nightstand cleared out, my toothbrush gone from our bathroom. Did he notice my wedding ring on his pillow right away? Did he pick it up suddenly, understanding the weight of what was happening? Did he try calling me, texting me, only to receive no response? I wondered if he ran his hands through his hair the way he always did when stressed, trying to make sense of my disappearance. Had he convinced himself this couldn't be happening? That I couldn't possibly have discovered his affair with Melissa? Mike had said her name was in his report. Melissa. I could almost see him noticing the envelope on our dining room table. The USB drive beside it, the small wrapped package containing the vintage watch I'd tracked down months ago, back when I still believed our marriage was worth saving. Did his hands tremble as he opened the envelope to find divorce papers with my signature already on them? Did he plug the USB drive into his laptop with dread pooling in his stomach? I imagined his face as he scrolled through photo after photo, video after video, every secret meeting, every lie, every betrayal laid bare with timestamps and locations. Had the final photo of him and Melissa at dinner tonight, at the very moment I'd been waiting alone at our anniversary dinner, hit him like a physical blow? How? I pictured him whispering, scrolling through the evidence again in disbelief. How had I known? How long had I known? Had the weight of what he'd done, what he'd lost, come crashing down all at once? In all our years together, John had grown confident in my forgiveness, in my loyalty. He'd never considered I might simply walk away. That wasn't our pattern. He made mistakes. I forgave. Not this time. I wondered if he'd noticed the small wrapped package, if his hand shook as he unwrapped it to find the vintage watch he'd admired months ago. Had he remembered mentioning it? Once, casually, never expecting me to remember, let alone track it down. Had he strapped it to his wrist, feeling its weight as a reminder of everything he'd thrown away? And my note? Had my words cut through his excuses, his prepared apologies? John, bye. Now you've seen the evidence. There's no need for explanations or apologies. We both know the truth. I won't be coming back. The divorce papers outline a fair division of our assets. My lawyer will contact yours to finalize the details. These past 12 years weren't a waste, at least not for me. I learned what I want, what I deserve, and what I will no longer accept. I hope you find whatever you're looking for. Rachel. No accusations. No emotional pleas. No opportunity for him to explain or excuse. Just clean, clinical finality, I imagined. John sinking into a dining room chair, the house's silence crushing him. He'd expected anger if I ever found out, screaming, crying, the chance to beg forgiveness, to promise it would never happen again. He'd prepared for that scenario, confident in his ability to talk his way back into my good graces. But my silent disappearance, this complete erasure of myself from our life, he had no defense against it. I pictured him looking around our half-empty house, seeing for the first time how thoroughly I'd been woven into every aspect of our home, and how completely I had now removed myself. The spaces where my books had been, the hooks where my coats had hung, the corner where my reading chair had sat, all vacant now, like the space I'd occupied in his heart while he'd been distracted by something new and exciting. Rachel, I imagined him whispering to the empty room, as if saying my name might conjure me back. But there was no response, just the echo of his voice in a house that no longer felt like home. John had finally returned, only to discover that I had already gone, taking with me not just my belongings, but the foundation upon which he'd built his entire life. He'd expected to come home to an argument, or perhaps to a tearful wife awaiting an apology. Instead, he'd found the consequences of his actions laid out in missing books, empty closets, and signed divorce papers. For the first time, John would realize he might have lost me forever. Not in a blaze of anger, but in a quiet, dignified exit he'd never seen coming. Sitting in Jen's guest bedroom that night, I felt a strange sense of peace, imagining John's realization. I hadn't been there to witness it, but somehow I knew exactly how it had unfolded. And for once, I didn't feel the need to comfort him through the consequences of his own actions. The days following my departure unfolded with a strange sense of calm I hadn't expected to feel. Jen's guest room became my sanctuary as I rebuilt the foundations of my life, calling my attorney, finding a new apartment, informing friends of what had happened without dwelling on the details. "You're handling this remarkably well," Jen commented one evening as we shared takeout on her couch. "I did all my grieving in advance," I explained, realizing it was true. Those 2 months of suspicion, of lying awake at night wondering if I was crazy, that was my mourning period. By the time I had proof, I'd already processed most of the pain. What I didn't tell her was how often my thoughts drifted to John, wondering how he was coping with the aftermath of my departure. Not out of concern for his well-being, but out of curiosity about the consequences finally catching up to him. I found out a week later when Marie, our mutual friend, called me. "I just had coffee with John," she said, her voice careful, measuring each word. "He asked me to check if you're okay." "What did he say?" I asked, surprised by my own detachment. "Rachel, he's a mess. He said he's been calling and texting you nonstop." It was true. 63 missed calls, dozens of voicemails I hadn't bothered to listen to, countless text messages ranging from angry, "How could you just leave like this?" to pleading, "Please just talk to me," to defeated, "I know I don't. Deserve another chance." "He's barely sleeping," Marie continued. "He showed up looking like he'd aged 10 years in a week. Said the house feels like a mausoleum without you." I felt a flicker of satisfaction, immediately followed by guilt for feeling it. "Did he tell you why I left?" "He said he made a terrible mistake, that he'd gotten caught up in something meaningless, and lost sight of what really mattered." She paused. "He didn't go into details, but I figured it out." "And?" I prompted. "And nothing. I told him actions have consequences, that you deserve better. I smiled, grateful for her loyalty. Thank you. He asked if I thought you'd ever forgive him. Marie added hesitantly. What did you tell him? That I didn't know, but that he should be prepared for you not to. After we hung up, I sat with that thought. Forgiveness had always been my default, my reflex, especially with John. But this time felt different. This wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about protecting my peace, my future, my sense of self-worth. 2 weeks after I left, I met with my attorney to finalize the divorce paperwork. As I exited the building, I spotted a familiar figure leaning against my car. John, looking exactly as Marie had described. Haggard, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes. Rachel, he said, straightening as I approached. Please, just 5 minutes. Part of me wanted to walk right past him, but I'd have to face him eventually. Better now, on my terms, than later in a courtroom. 5 minutes, I agreed, keeping my distance. I've been trying to reach you, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I know. I made the biggest mistake of my life, he said, eyes pleading. What I had with Melissa. It wasn't real. It was an escape, a fantasy. You're my reality, my home. Was, I corrected quietly. I was your reality. Can we just talk about this? About what happened? About how to fix it? I studied his face. The face I'd woken up to for 12 years. The face I thought I knew better than my own. Now it felt like looking at a stranger. There's nothing to fix, John. You made choices. I made mine. But don't I at least deserve a chance to explain? To apologize properly? His voice cracked. The house is so empty without you. I keep expecting to hear your voice, to see you turning the corner. I can't sleep in our bed anymore. Our bed, I repeated. The same bed you shared with her when I was visiting my mother in March? He flinched as if I'd struck him. The photos from Mike's report had been explicit about which betrayals had happened where. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I don't even recognize the person I became. Please, Rachel. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes. I felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction at his pain. No desire to wound him further. Just a profound certainty that this chapter of my life was closed. I hope you find peace, John. I really do. But it won't be with me. You're really not coming back? The realization seemed to hit him anew, the finality of it washing over his face. No, I'm not. What am I supposed to do now? He asked, desperation edging into his voice. That's not my concern anymore. I moved past him to unlock my car door. My attorney will be in touch about finalizing the divorce. As I started the engine, he placed his hand on my window. I still love you, Rachel. I looked up at him, at the man who had once been the center of my world. If this is what your love looks like, I'm better off without it. I drove away, watching him shrink in my rearview mirror, a solitary figure standing in the parking lot, finally facing the consequences of choices he'd never expected would cost him everything. Over the following weeks, evidence of those consequences continued to surface. Friends reported that John had stopped coming to social gatherings. His sister called me, concerned about his drinking. Colleagues mentioned he seemed distracted at work, making mistakes that weren't characteristic of his usual precision. The house, our house, went on the market. John apparently unable to live with the ghosts of our marriage. I signed the necessary paperwork without seeing him again. Our communications filtered through attorneys. I heard through mutual friends that Melissa had ended things once John's marriage dissolved. She told him she didn't sign up to be his emotional support through a divorce, Marie informed me over lunch. Apparently the affair was exciting when it was forbidden, less so when it came with real-world complications. Do you feel vindicated? Jen asked me one evening, after sharing another update on John's downward spiral. I considered the question carefully. No, I answered honestly. I don't take pleasure in his pain. But I don't feel responsible for it either. That was the key difference in who I'd become. The old Rachel would have felt compelled to ease John's suffering, to shoulder the burden of his mistakes alongside him. The new Rachel understood that his choices had led to these consequences, and my only obligation was to my own healing. 6 months after I left, our divorce was finalized. John didn't contest any of my terms, signing everything without negotiation. My attorney seemed surprised by his compliance. Usually when there's infidelity involved, there's more pushback, she commented, handing me the final decree. He's giving you more than you'd likely get if this went to court. I think he's trying to earn forgiveness through generosity, I replied. Has it worked? She asked, curious. I thought about it, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, how one could exist without the other. I've forgiven him, I said slowly. Not for his sake, but for mine. I don't want to carry that anger anymore. But forgiveness doesn't mean I want him back in my life, as I signed the last document, officially ending our 12-year marriage. I felt no regret, no second thoughts. Just a quiet certainty that I was moving forward exactly as I should be. The consequences of John's infidelity had rippled out far beyond our marriage, affecting his career, his relationships, his sense of self. But those ripples were no longer my concern. I had built a lifeboat and sailed away from the wreckage, leaving him to navigate the aftermath alone. Some might call it cold. I called it self-preservation. And for the first time in my adult life, I was putting myself first, without guilt, without hesitation, without looking back to see if John was still standing where I'd left him.